Luke chapter 16 is where we want to go to kind of follow suit with what we've been doing. We're going to look at what we spoke a little bit on Sunday morning and kind of go a little deeper with it. So Luke chapter 16, I want to read it first and then we'll share some thoughts about it. Keep in mind this is a parable, one of 38 that Christ spoke, that he uses. We commonly refer to it as an earthly story that has a heavenly meaning. And so he's using something from an earthly situation to get across a theme that has spiritual information for us to have and to hold on to. So keep that in mind. It is out of the 38 parables, there's 16 that deal with finances or with money, stewardship type things. And this is one of them. Now, out of the 38, if you have 16 that deal with finances or stewardship or money, if you want to call it that, probably means that Christ knew we needed help in how to deal with that. So keep that in mind as we look at it. Let's start reading verse 1, chapter 16. It says, "He also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. And the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you,'" now this is Jesus speaking again, "'I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." And then look at verse 14, because we'll touch on it. "The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him." So as Christ spoke it, the Pharisees poked fun, made accusations, whatever you'd want to say. They ridiculed him, though. So let's back up and let's kind of talk through this a little bit. What was the issue that was brought to the rich man, and did the rich man do anything wrong? So what's the issue that was brought to his attention?
Managing his money or his belongings like he should.
So he's got a guy he's employed, and he's not doing the job that he should be doing. He's taking advantage of or not managing it well. Did the rich man do anything wrong? Yeah, the only thing we might could say is, well, maybe he didn't evaluate the manager very well. We might could say that, but that's kind of a stretch. What's that?
He held him accountable.
He did hold him accountable after it was brought to his attention, so he held him accountable. He didn't do anything wrong in terms of him making decisions with his money that would have been incorrect, and that's really not the overall theme of what this parable is trying to get across anyway. But when we look at it, we don't see that he made a bad mistake. The manager is the one that's making the mistakes, not dealing properly with what he had. Question 2 then, what's the overall teaching of the parable? Because that's important for us to know it helps us to interpret it then as we go along. What's the overall teaching of the parable? If you had to make one statement about this. Honesty, okay. That could be something we take away.
I would say putting money before God, not making God number one.
Okay.
priority.
So idols maybe in front of God. Okay. What else could we say?
You're faithful and little things.
Okay. Faithful in little, you'll be faithful in much. What else could we say? These are all right. I'm just.
I think our stewardship is in all aspects.
I was thinking that, manage your money so that you can make a heavenly impact.
Yeah, I actually wrote down, y'all are right with me. I wrote down, does our investments reap eternal dividends? So do our investments reap eternal dividends? Now, that's not always money either. That could be time. It could be individuals that we have the opportunity to disciple or witness to, however you want to term that. Is our investment in them reaping eternal benefits, or are we reaping worldly benefits by what we're investing in other people? So it's not always finances. So stewardship is a good term to use there, because that is encompassing all things. Question 3 then, what is money a test of? Faith? Okay.
I'm going to say, like, your priorities of your love, because, you have to choose worldly things or, and that's a tough call for some people. It's tough
Yeah.
to get to that point where you can see that none of this stuff matters.
Yeah, it is hard to get there. The term that I put is the lordship of Christ, which is really kind of what you're talking about. Because if Christ is Lord, then every decision that we make with what we've been given, whether it's money, time, whatever it may be, every decision we make with that then means that we're acknowledging Jesus has full control of everything that we're doing. So we make decisions based upon then eternal dividends or eternal benefits instead of our own individual interest. And when we start placing other things as our Lord, then that gets really convoluted and we start making decisions that don't necessarily have eternal rewards or eternal benefits. So it's a test of who is Lord of our life, the lordship of Christ. Because if we keep in mind, Christ is directing this parable. Look back at verse 1. He also said to the what? Disciples. Yeah, that was an easy one. Yeah, it was disciples. It's right there. It doesn't get any easier than that one. I'm going to tell you this. Okay. So he said it to the disciples, which means he's talking to people that believe in him at this point. That's who he's addressing. So he's saying, what I'm giving you is a test of if you're truly going to make me your Lord. Does that make sense? Question 4 then, why did the manager have to go out and gain friends who would help him after he lost his livelihood? So after the rich man says you're no longer employed, why did he have to go out and gain friends? Do what? He'd been over them? Is that what you said?
He was the lender, and they were the.
Okay.
He had probably, I'm sure he had pressure on him in the past.
Okay.
I think he was seeking favor among them.
He was seeking favor among them. Kind of the you scratch my, or I'll scratch your back, but you scratch mine here in a little while kind of thing. The fact that he had to go out and get friends meant that he did not have what? Mike kind of touched on it. He didn't have friends. He's having to go out and gain them because he don't have them. Now, can we be the manager of something and be managing something that someone may owe us or pay rent on, whatever it may be? Can we still do that in a way where they will be our friend? Yeah, it can be done that way, but apparently he was not, because he's having to go out and gain that. So he doesn't have this type of relationship that's good. Now, we know he's a poor manager. So we know that from the beginning. He's taking advantage of the rich man in some way, which also would, when you get on over to, I think Anita mentioned it, if you're faithful in a little, you'll be faithful in much. If you're not, then you won't be in whatever he's given. He's showing that what he's managing from the rich man, he's not faithful in it very well. He shows that again when he goes out and tries to gain these friends. He's not doing the rich man a favor in terms of his possessions, right? So he had to go out and gain friends because he apparently did not have any. How did the manager's actions affect the rich man? Let me say this before we answer that. It's somewhat interesting that the rich man comes to him and says, all right, you've been doing stuff completely wrong, so I need you to gather everything up and report back to me, and then you're not going to be employed anymore. You ever seen that work out well in a job type situation? Typically, if someone's doing that kind of activity, typically what they'll say is, all right, you're done, we're going to walk you out the door right now. That's not what goes on here, which means this guy has a window of time to do some things, and he's trying to gain these friends through that window of time and that action. So how did his actions affect the rich man? The obvious one is it cost him what? Cost him money. Yeah. He cost him money. He didn't hold people accountable to what they were supposed to pay. What else could it possibly have done for him?
I think it could have probably ruined his reputation a little bit too, like, you know, this man's working for you, and, you know, he kind of represents you since you're manager, and if he's going out and, you know, not doing what he should be doing, then that's a reflection as well.
Okay. Yeah. Could have ruined. Think about, so let's say that, now we don't really know how he went out and positioned this. So if he went out and he said, hey, you know, I've got this flexibility from the owner here, we can reduce your bill. And he would have said, we can reduce your bill. Would the rich man have gained favor with these individuals? He could have, because they would think, oh, for some reason, this guy's taking away some of my debt. That's pretty nice. Now, it would have been the manager gaining some favor and the rich man gaining some favor, possibly. We don't know exactly how he positioned this necessarily. He just tells them, hey, take what is your bill, take it quickly, and take this much off of it in both situations. Keep in mind, too, it probably wasn't just two people. There's probably multiple people that he's doing this with. Christ just names two of them. Question 6, what was the rich man's reaction to what happened? Look at verse 8. What was the master's reaction?
He praised him.
Isn't that odd? He either praised or commended, whichever version you have in that. So this is the guy the individual you have employed that you've told, okay, gather up all this stuff and come give me a report because you're fixing to be fired. He goes out and he costs him money, but then the guy says, wow, you done a really interesting, good thing there. He doesn't say good, but he commends him in his actions. But yet he cost him money. It's kind of an interesting concept. Why do you think he would commend him on that? Wasn't as dumb as he thought? Okay.
He could have done worse.
Could have done worse. Was he commending that he cut the bill down? Or what was he really commending?
He was taking care of himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was being clever, but the rich man didn't seem to realize either that he was gaining favor with worldly people.
Possibly. Yeah. You're talking about the rich man was gaining favor with worldly people? Or the manager? Yeah, gotcha.
Like
Yeah.
he said, oh, well, at least you were clever about it, like almost was tricky in how he did it,
Yeah.
but still not realizing that didn't do him any good either. You know, it didn't do the manager any good.
Right. So was Jesus commending dishonesty? Because Jesus is the one telling the story, right? So is he commending dishonesty? The shrewdness of it, yeah. So how does that apply then to us living in the kingdom today? Are we to be shrewd? And if so, how are we to be shrewd? Are we supposed to take advantage of other people?
I think we have to be shrewd when it comes to the devil. You have to be aware of what you're doing.
Okay.
Not hurt people.
Okay.
Be wary of where they're coming from. Is the devil actually going to them to us or? Just let's be honest.
Right.
Well, we need to use our earthly resources for the kingdom. You know, we need to be careful, and if we need to be good stewards of what we get on this world and spend it for the eternal kingdom, not for the world.
Yeah. It's interesting, and we'll touch on this a little bit more when we get down to verse 9, because he really talks about this unrighteous wealth, and we have to figure out what he's talking about when he says unrighteous wealth, because that's kind of a hard concept for us to grasp until we kind of talk through that maybe. Question A, what was Jesus promoting by telling the parable? And we kind of touched on like investments should reap eternal dividends, which is kind of what was said down here in the front. But he also was touching on the manager's ability to have foresight and diligence to follow through and to make friends. Do we need to have foresight and diligence as we work in the kingdom? As we work in the kingdom, is it always about today? No. This guy, if you think about it, the manager, now not the rich man, but the manager, when he goes in and he says, all right, reduce your bills, was that benefiting him in that moment in time, or was that going to benefit him later on? Later, right? So when we think about working in the kingdom, we have to think about an eternal view, but we also have to think down the road while we're still here on earth, assuming that God gives us another 5, 10, 20 years, whatever it may be. We have to think a little bit from the standpoint of being diligent and having foresight in what we do. Now, let's put that into the context of a church. Does a church need to have foresight and diligence in what they do? Yeah. Think about it. Let's talk about it from this standpoint. Let's say that a church had the ability to seat, for easy numbers, had the ability to seat 100 people. And so they get to where they're having 95 come. And they say, man, this is great. And they're kind of on this upswing kind of thing. And they got 95 people walking in. They can seat 100. That's all they can do. Do they wait till they get to the 100 before they do anything different? Or when they're about 80, 85, do they start saying, hey, we got to start thinking about some things here?
I think they start making an AM service when they hit that point.
Let's think about it in terms of how we deal with individuals who are lost. Is it always about us getting them to say, I need Jesus in this moment right now? Yeah. We have to be diligent, and we have to have some foresight into thinking through how are we going to approach them. The church has to do that too, right? It would be great if everyone that walked in the door that needed Christ got saved as soon as they walked in the door. But that's not always going to happen, which is why you have events that go on at church in order to try and create relationships and bonds and introduce them to new people and all of that stuff that goes on within a church is so that that we're setting the groundwork for what the decision will be, hopefully quickly, but it may be down the road a little ways. So all that stuff plays into it. As individuals, we have to have foresight. You do this with your kids. Like when your child is first born, you don't go and lean over their crib and say, okay, here's how you tie your shoe, and here's how you eat, and here's how you dress yourself, and here's all your colors. You need to know all these by tomorrow morning, right? You don't do that with your child, but you have foresight that at this age, they have the ability to learn this thing. And then when they get a little bit older, they have the ability to learn this. And so you kind of stretch it out over time. And you have this target that, and depending on what the target is, but let's just say it's 18, they graduate high school. You have this target of, okay, by the time they turn 18, they need to really be able to kind of self-sustain themselves to some degree, right? Like they need to be able to go out and get a job and help get themselves through college or whatever it may be. Or, I mean, there's different timelines. I understand that. But there's also some foresight we have to have for those things to be planned. Christ is, as he tells this story, he's commending the guy that as he makes these decisions and tells these people to mark this off their bill, he's not saying, or the manager is not making these decisions that help him right now, but it helps him as soon as he gets fired, which is down the road a little bit. Now, is he going to go to every one of those people that he helped on the very first day and say, I need somewhere to stay and I need some food? Probably not, because he's going to stretch it out as long as he can, right? So he's going to go to person A and maybe stays there for a day or so, and he doesn't wear out his welcome because in another month or so, he may need to come back to person A and say, hey, I need to stay another night or two. Can I do that? So he has the foresight to plan those things out. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, and Christ wasn't either. He's just saying, this guy's got some smarts about what he's doing here. And we do, as we work in the kingdom, we need to have that as we work in the kingdom as well. Look at question 9 then. Who are people of the world and who are people of light? So people of the world are people who are what? Non-believers. We might also could say they are not committed to God and they are not committed to eternal things. So they're thinking of the here and now, the moment that they're living in. You've heard the slogan or the phrase that goes around in our culture today, seize the day or seize the moment, which sometimes you can say, okay, maybe that has some good connotations if you're sharing the gospel, but at the same time, they're living for the moment in that moment in time, and we have to live with eternity in mind. All right, what about then, who are the people of light? It would be believers. Question 10 then, what are believers to do with financial opportunities? What are churches to do with financial opportunities? So let's answer the church one first. What is should a church do with financial opportunities? Look for ways to grow the kingdom. Is there any one answer to that? No. There's not. Here is one answer, though. Let's say that a church is given $500,000. And they say, and let's say it's a church of 100 people. And they say, let's stick that $500,000 back in the bank somewhere, and we'll figure out what to do with it later. Now, while you may need 6 months to figure out the best way to use it, when you get 6 years down the road and you're still hanging on to that line of thought, you're probably not using it to grow the kingdom. So for a church to say, we're going to take advantage of a financial opportunity to grow the kingdom, what are some ways that can occur? Missions. Missions, no matter if it's local, around the world, whatever it may be, missions is an opportunity to grow the kingdom. Is it always going to be missions? Not always. Doesn't mean that missions is wrong. It just may not be the right thing in that moment in time. It may be the right thing, but it may be that and something else possibly. What else could the something else be?
Helping
Could be helping other churches, whether it be in the community or even across the way somewhere.
Investing.
Well, like you talked about the church with the 85 people, about to get 95, you need to accommodate your needs of the church, buildings and
Yeah.
parking lots.
Yeah, sometimes we got to say, okay, we're at 85, so we got to think about, if we can only seat 100, we got to think about, are we just going to stay at 100, or are we going to knock the wall out and make it a little bit bigger where we can go to 150 or whatever it may be?
Or if your parking lot only able to buy parking spots, and the other people have to cross the highway, or you can expand your parking lot.
Tiffany, what did you say?
I said investing in our youth.
Investing in our youth. So, and I'm going to just umbrella that and say discipleship. It can be youth, it can be adults, it can be whatever age you want to throw in there. But sometimes the right thing to do is say, all right, we need to spend about 10 grand, equip our own church to be able to go out better and share the gospel, or to grow our own church in some way. There's not any one right answer. That's why prayer is really important, to let God open up our mind to what we need to do with it. We also know that He gave us some biblical guidelines as well, so we have to work within those and realize that our prayer should lead us to something within that. Now, what about believers? What are believers to do with financial opportunities? Pray about it for sure. Okay. What else?
We are the church, we should do the same.
Yeah. It should be very similar, but it may look a little bit different in terms of individually. We may see a need that a church may not see because we're out in a working relationship within the community somewhere. We may have the opportunity to do that. But
So that question brought up the question in me about the rich man. Was the rich man diligent, or was he being a good steward of his time and money if he didn't know what was going on with his own money?
that
Someone else had to go to him and tell him that someone's taking advantage of him?
right. He had placed trust in someone to do it for him, and that's why we might could say he kind of messed up by putting the wrong guy there. But at the same time, you don't know. Some people can talk a good game in the beginning, and you just don't know. But the one thing we can say is when he did realize it, he dealt with it. So that we can say. How long he knew about it before he dealt with it, we don't know. But if he would not have dealt with it, then we would say it's not a very good steward from his perspective either. Question 11 then, from verse 9. How is it that we may be received into the eternal dwellings? So look at verse 9. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. How is it that we may be received into the eternal dwellings? And let me make this statement first, because I want to make sure we don't get off track. We do not buy our way or earn our way into heaven. That is only through the blood of Christ that occurs. So we got to make sure we don't get off on that line of thinking as we talk about this. But as we look at what Christ says in verse 9, how is it that we may be received into the eternal dwellings?
They were good stewards of our money, our time, anything we get involved with, we need to be making sure it's what God's leading us to be doing.
So let's say that someone says, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ and a follower of His. But then, as we spend our bank account, it does not show that our Lord is Christ. Did that make sense in what I just said?
I think verse 13 answers the question, no one can serve two masters.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to be careful. We can make statements about who we are all the day long.
Your choice of friends can contribute to that too.
Choice friends can contribute to it. Yeah, they have an influence one way or the other.
You have a friend that always says,
Let's talk a little bit about a phrase that he uses there in verse 9. He says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. What is unrighteous wealth? Required what? Acquiring unjustly. Okay. Okay. What's the only thing in this world that has the ability to be righteous? Ability is not a good word. That has the opportunity to be righteous. What's the only thing in this world that has the opportunity to be righteous? Someone said it, I think. People. Yeah. Through the blood of Christ, right? That's the only way that we can be righteous. Now, why can something else not be righteous? I'm sorry? Yeah. Human is the only thing that has a soul. So if you take money, it has no righteous or unrighteous value. It can be used righteously and it can be used unrighteously, but it has no righteous ability. It just exists. The pew you're sitting on right now has no righteous ability. It exists. It can be used in a righteous way. It can be used in an unrighteous way, but it has no ability to be righteous itself. That's true with anything in this world other than ourselves, because we have a soul. We have the ability to turn to Christ. We have the ability to be made well through His sacrifice, His blood, us crying out to Him, saying, I need a Savior. You're the only one. We have that ability then to become righteous through Him. It's not our own doing. It is through Him. So when he makes this statement, he says, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. He's basically saying, all the possessions that you have, use them in a way that would gain you friends. Now, what kind of friends is he talking about? Is this just some good old boy that kind of randomly lives down the road and we just want to have a good time with him and hang out on Friday nights and shoot the bull every once in a while? Is that what he's talking about here? No. So what is he talking about?
Whenever to use your unrighteous will so that when it fails you, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. So I would assume that the they is the friends that you make, and if they are receiving you into eternal dwellings, then they would be believers along with you.
Yeah. In other words, use your possessions that have no righteous ability, but use them in a righteous way so that you create friends who are thinking eternally just the same as we should be as well. So we use our unrighteous stuff to influence individuals to become righteous. It's kind of the overall of that verse. Which means then we take what we have, whether it be finances, whether it be possessions we own, our homes, whatever it may be, we use those things in order to reap eternal dividends through Christ. Question 12 then, what do we learn from verses 10 through 12? Verse 10, one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. One who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? So what do we learn from those verses? You, yeah, you're either dishonest or you're not. What I wrote down is how they handle worldly wealth shows their trustworthiness. How they handle worldly wealth shows their trustworthiness. So if we've been entrusted with the gospel, does the way we handle worldly wealth show anything about how we're going to handle the gospel? Possibly.
How you, your relationship with God, how you are with that is how you, like, let's say commitment. Your commitment to God will be probably a reflection of how you commit to other things in life. If that's your first commitment, I've always heard it that way, like if you can't even commit there for yourself, if you're not committed.
Okay, say that one more time.
Like your first commitment should be to God.
Yes.
And if you are not upholding that commitment, as, you know, you say you are, like it goes, you know, ways back and forth, then a lot of times your earthly commitments will be the same.
Yeah, and that is true. The hard part is we can't determine by looking at someone what their true commitment is to God. So when we look at their commitment to what He's given them, earthly possessions, if they handle that well, and they are professing to be a believer, then we could probably say, okay, if they're trustworthy with this stuff, they're probably going to be trustworthy in their relationship with God. That's the only measure that we can, really see, the fruit that we see in their life, how they handle things that's been given to them. Because if you think about a church hiring a pastor, would you ever hire a pastor that just cannot handle money very well?
And I was even thinking of it not in a money perspective, but even like his family, his wife, and children. That's stewardship
Yeah.
in a way.
And you can throw that into even what he does with his time. What he does with his time, what he does with his finances, whatever God's given him, whatever he does with that. Like you wouldn't hire, I'm just going to use money because it's easy for us to see, but if the guy is bankrupt and he can't pay his bills, are you really excited to have him come speak to you in your pulpit? Probably not, right? Now, is that fair? Well, Christ tells us, if you're not trustworthy in small things, should you be trustworthy in big things? And so we have to take those things into account. That is a reflection of what we might say our fruit as well in life. Question 13, is heaven's riches or earthly wealth more valuable? Hopefully that's an easy one for you as well. Heaven's riches are more valuable than earthly wealth. We can say that sitting here, right? Does that get harder when we walk out on the street and we live day to day? It's okay to be honest in here. You're not going to be judged. It does sometimes get harder. But it's easy for us to say, heaven's riches are much more important than anything else in this world. But then when we get out in the world, sometimes it's hard to keep that in mind. How do we gain heaven's riches?
Honoring Christ.
Salvation first. After that would be this word stewardship we've been throwing around, right? Because it's stewardship not just of money, it's stewardship of the gospel so that others hear. It's stewardship of the time that we have to glorify God, honor Him through the time He's given us. Like we don't forsake that, but we be a good steward of it so that that's a part of our life as well. Now, question 14, from verse 13, what does it mean to serve? So verse 13 says, no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. What is that word serve? What does it mean? To be loyal to or work for. Okay.
Prioritize.
Prioritize, okay.
To
Okay, so to be obedient to the instruction given. I'd wrote down to be a slave to or to belong to. So if you think about that, no servant can be enslaved to two masters. No servant can belong to two masters, right? Because either you'll love the one and hate the other, or whatever, as we go down. Question 15, is Jesus implying that to be a Christian you cannot have wealth? No. There are some extremely faithful Christians who have wealth, but they're using that wealth wisely. They're using it to benefit the kingdom in some way. Does it mean that a individual who is poor is not in favor with God? No. You know, we don't always understand why you have two individuals that are Christians. Both of them are faithfully trying to serve God, be enslaved to serve God. One of them has much, one of them has little. We don't know why. Except maybe the area that they're serving in, which area either one of them is, maybe the area they're serving in, they can better reach the people that God has for them to reach because they either have more or they have little, one of the two. We don't know. And we can't say that the ones that have the most are the ones that God has more favor on either, because that's not what he's teaching here. What we have to do as a believer is we just have to be faithful with what we do have, knowing that God is always going to provide for the needs that we have in some way. Now look at question 15 then. Question 16. Money is God's loan to you for two blanks, never a measure of your real worth. So money is God's loan to you for your what? Let's look at the last part of that and then we'll come back to the blanks. Is money ever a measure of our real worth? No. Do we sometimes think of it that way? People that have a lot tend to attract more of a crowd than the ones that have nothing, right? Think of it on the main stage scene. That tends to happen. But that's not the way God looks at things. Maybe the way earthly things get viewed, but it's not the way God does. So money is God's loan to you for smart stewardship. But it's never a measure of your real worth. Smart stewardship, but never a measure of your real worth. And then question 17. From verse 14. Even if the words who were lovers of money were not included in the verse, could we come to this conclusion by their reaction? So, we get verse 14. The Pharisees, so after Christ finishes speaking this, and he's speaking it to his disciples, but the Pharisees are standing there. So the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. What if that little phrase, who were lovers of money, was not there? What if it just read, the Pharisees heard all these things, and they ridiculed him? Could we come to the same conclusion about their reaction? I think we could, but why would we come to that conclusion? They ridiculed him, okay. Why would they ridicule him?
The verses before, you can't serve two masters, you can't serve God and money.
Say it one more time.
You can't serve God and money.
Okay.
So they were ridiculing them because they were serving money.
Okay.
I think it's the same as if you think of the story about the guy that says, I've done everything I can to serve you. What else can I do? And he's like, go sell all of your
pleased on things. He never says he's a lover of money,
Right.
but it's pretty obvious he's a lover of money.
Right, because he won't go sell the stuff. He leaves sad, and it doesn't ever say that he sells the things. What tends to happen today? Let's say someone gives a speech, and people start ridiculing him or her, whichever one. Why do they ridicule them? They disagree.
They don't feel uncomfortable. They pushed in a hot spot.
Yeah. It may be, no, let's preface it with the two, let's preface it that the individual speaking truth, and they ridicule him. There's a good chance it's because he's, phrase we use sometimes, stepped on toes, or it hurts. And so their way of dealing with it is to ridicule. We have to be careful that sometimes we may not find ourselves in that spot. That we hear something that's just is not comfortable at all. It goes against maybe what we've heard before from maybe, let's go ancestrally or generationally, we've heard it. And it goes against that, and so we say, well, that just can't be right. Before we would ridicule, what should we do? Research. We need to see, is it truth or not? Because if it's truth, we can't ridicule it. We have to become humbled by it, but not ridicule it. And should we ever really ridicule? What should we do? So let's say, I'm sorry. Love, okay. So let's say that let's just put it in this perspective. Let's say that I speak on something and it hurts, okay? What should be the reaction of that individual? Okay, but let's say that they're having a hard time seeing that. Should the reaction be, I'm just going to walk out of here and never come back? Should the reaction be, I'm going to go talk to him about this because I'm not sure that I see it that way? Instead of ridiculing, we really need to have the conversation, right? Because then we have a chance to kind of talk through and we can look to word and maybe I'm wrong about it. Let's say that we hear something because we have social media all over the place now, right? So let's say that we listen to something that someone broadcasts, and let's say that they're 5-6 states away. So we don't have the ability to go to where they are to have the conversation with them. And we do research and we find out it's wrong. Okay? So we've understood for ourselves this is not right because we've looked here and we see it's wrong. But we've got a buddy that has listened to it and they've bought into it. What do we do? Do we ridicule the individual to the buddy? What do we do? Yeah. Do we have an obligation to correct the incorrect thinking? What's even better than a private message? Face to face, right? Go into them face to face and say, hey, heard you said this or made this statement. I just want to visit with you about this because I'm having trouble looking at God's word and seeing what you said. And then they're going to say, well, I heard this from a preacher online, so it's got to be right. You say, well, let's look at what God's word says. The worst thing we can do is let them continue to believe something that's false, right? And do we really get anywhere by ridiculing the guy that said the false thing? Now, what we might do as we have this conversation with the person that believed it, what ends up happening is then the person that first heard it, that was believing it, realize, okay, I can't really trust everything that this guy's saying. But it doesn't do us any good to ridicule the person. Now, we know here in this situation, the Pharisees are lovers of money. That's the deal. That's why they're ridiculing. That's why they're having trouble with Christ. It's because they love money. Christ is speaking against it, and so they don't like it. Is it hard for us to talk about money today? I saw some heads say, yeah. Do we get uncomfortable when lessons come up about finances?
They can if you're not using them that way.
Yeah. I'll ask you this. You think we've had as much discussion tonight as we do on a regular Wednesday night? Sometimes we tend to clam up when we talk about finances, and yet when we look at the parables that Christ spoke, 38, and he uses 16 of them to talk about it, it probably means we need to become a little more open talking about it. I'm not criticizing tonight. I'm just saying, when we look at the Word, this is what we see. Here's the one thing that we should all want to be, like, regardless of how we're using them right now, we should want to be using them correctly. Which means that if we are getting it wrong, hopefully we would welcome the idea of maybe I'm not doing this right and I need to do it in a better way. Which means we would allow ourselves to have a conversation. It is hard sometimes because it is near and dear to our heart. We don't like people telling us how we should do it. We don't like people telling us how we should use our time sometimes, right? But all of those things are indicative of a servant that shows the Lord is the Lord of their life. And so sometimes the hard conversations are needed. And I'm not talking about necessarily in church. They are needed in church. But I'm talking about outside of church, when we're dealing with friends, when we're dealing with family members, even when we're dealing as husband and wife. Do we ever have to have those hard conversations about what God has given us and how it's being used? Because sometimes, and it's not always one individual either, but within a household relationship, sometimes one person this month is just not doing wisely with God's resources He's given us. The next month, it may be the other person. We have to kind of find that right path. And sometimes we have to be reminded both ways, right? I was waiting for Mike to talk because this will be good. Shannon's sitting close. This is going to be really good.
He was saying that his taxes are thousands a year, the United States takes, and he said they're giving it to every charity in the world, everything in the world you can think of. And he said, I'm barely making it as it is. He said the church was set up to take care of the community. He said, in a sense, I'm giving more than 10%. That's what he told me. He said, but with the church not taking the role it's not supposed to be taken. And I said, why? I mean, what do you say to that? What do you say to it like that? I don't know what to say.
You always ask some good questions, Mike. I'm sorry.
Give Caesar what's due to Caesar.
Yeah. Give to God what's God's. So here's the... If you go back to Old Testament, what was the reason that they brought the tithe into we're going to call it storehouse. It was a temple then. What was the reason that they brought that in? Sacrifice. It was used for that, to take care of the priests and all that was done within the temple as well. That was one of the reasons. What was the ultimate reason that God wanted them to bring it there? First fruit. If they brought, I'm sorry.
Just be obedient.
To obedient. It was to show who they really served. Because if they brought the first fruit in and they were joyous in doing it, then they showed who they served. I don't know who the individual is, so I don't want to say too much. I don't want to know, but if the individual is disgruntled, I mean, we've all been disgruntled with taxes probably somewhere along. Any of you ever been joyous about paying taxes? Just love it? Yeah. Okay, so if he's disgruntled paying taxes, but he's saying, so I'm giving to charity, but he's still disgruntled with it, that's not, I mean, it's not accomplishing what it's supposed to accomplish, right? So we give it to the Lord to show that He is Lord, and we do it joyously because we know that He's Lord, and whatever is done with it is going to be used for the upbuilding of the kingdom, right? When it goes in taxes, you really don't know where it's going. It's not all going to charity, I can promise that.
But let me ask this question though, but if you are doing that like this person's saying, if you give more to the Lord, does it not leave less for Caesar? You see what I'm saying? If you're giving your 10% and you feel like you're giving too much to taxes, then give more than 10% so there's less for taxes.
What tax?
Oh, okay, I get you. Like a deduction kind of thing, is what you're talking about, yeah.
But that's the way it works.
So if you itemize,
I mean,
yes.
if you're gonna give your money somewhere, why, I would rather give more to the church than to have to give it the other way.
Yeah.
I mean, is that not?
Yes, that is a way of looking at it as well. Because if you're able to itemize on your taxes, then that does work that way. If you're not able to itemize, it doesn't necessarily work that way.
They
But,
can't take what you don't have. I mean.
right. Well, you'd like to think that they can't. But, you know, that's a whole different lesson even, because Christ never, when he's hit with the question of, you know, so do we pay taxes? I'm just summarizing this. He doesn't say, yeah, disgruntledly go pay it. But basically the command is given to Caesar what is Caesar's. And he doesn't say do it disgruntledly and do it hatefully. Do we really think that the Roman government was using all the money that they got in the best possible way? No. So, you know, sometimes we have to look at maybe even our attitude of how we pay what we're supposed to pay to the government that we live up under, which is hard sometimes. Romans chapter 13 is probably a good study around this time of year if you want to go read it.
You have to think about what the consequences would be for them then and for us now. If you don't give to Caesar what's Caesar's, what's the consequence of that gonna be? And how helpful are you gonna be able to be, and how much of a servant are you gonna be able to be to others that you got all this tax debt? Or, you know, then if they didn't do it, maybe they would be imprisoned, and then,
Right.
you know, then what good would they be able to do?
Yeah, you also have to think about what kind of a name does that give a Christian that doesn't pay what they're supposed to pay as well. Kind of goes along with what you're saying.
It is the law.
Right.
And that's the bottom line.
Right.
It may not be agreeable, but it is what it is. Go vote.
Okay, with that, we're not going to go into that discussion. Yes, go vote, but that's as far as we're going, okay? It is, again, going back, it is interesting, Christ speaks on finances this much. There has to be value in us studying what the Bible says about it. So we don't need to shy away from it in our own personal study, okay? And if you would have any questions, want to discuss anything that I said tonight seems just a little off, come talk to me, because we would rather talk about it. Because I may have said something incorrectly. I hope I didn't, don't want to, but if I did, I want you to come, because we need to look at the Word together with it, okay? Let me share a couple of prayer requests with you tonight before we go, and then